Hi, everybody. This talk is the level design of Gone Home. I am Steve Gaynor. I was the writer and designer of Gone Home.
And I'm Kate, and I was the environment artist on Gone Home.
And so, yeah, we are going to be talking about how the art and design of the game came together to make the final player experience in Gone Home, which was an indie game that we released about a year and a half ago on PC, story exploration, first-person video game. We had a few experiential aims of Gone Home's level design and architecture. We're going to be talking about those today because there's a lot of technique that goes into building the spaces and building the art, but it all started from the viewpoint of what is the core player experience we want players to take away from this thing. That is to say, the intended feelings of inhabiting the space and the story, and the constraints and lack thereof of literalism and realism in the construction of the space towards those aims. And of course, the methods that we used to get to where we got to. One of our big goals in Gone Home was to tell a linear story through a non-linear space. The game takes place in one large house that a family lives in. And so we wanted to make the house and the story feel non-linear, like you were in control of exploring it as the player. And this was borne out in some of the response that we had to the game. This is Adventure Gamer, an excerpt from Adventure Gamer's review that says, Gone Home is largely non-linear, and you explore the roughly 25-room house at your own pace, deciding which rooms to enter, which lights to turn on, which drawers to open. Similarly, we wanted to make the house feel real and feel lived in. IGN said, everywhere you look, the house in Gone Home has a warm, lived-in feel. Games like The Last of Us and BioShock Infinite allow us to explore exceptionally realized worlds, but Gone Home's world just feels straight-up real. So success. We did it, right? There it is. But it's an illusion, Michael. We didn't really do it. So why was that the perception that people came away with? One of our goals was to say we want people to feel like this is a non-linear experience. And this is the map of the first and second floor of the house in Gone Home. When you look at it, it looks non-linear. The house is laid out as a bunch of interconnected rooms that aren't sort of an obvious central pipeline that you're guided through. But in practice, we used keys and gating to lock off major choke points of the house at the beginning. And so really, after one single branch in the player path at the beginning where you decide, am I going to go into the west hall or up the stairs, the player's path through the space is largely reliably predictable by the designer. You kind of have to go to one point to another to get the information and the keys that you need to finally progress to the next point in the game. It was not true nonlinearity on any level, though players felt that it was in many cases. Similarly, the feeling of the house being a real place is more kind of literally represented in some rooms. You look at this screenshot of the family room, the living room in Gone Home, and it scans as, oh yeah, that looks like just a family's place where they would watch TV. But you zoom out from a single room to the layout of the overall space, and it is in no way realistic. In fact, it is not physically possible. This is a bird's eye view of the entire house in the editor. And it's not 100% clear from a single view, but the second floor of the house is actually floating in space above nothing. And so, despite the fact that this is not a place that could ever exist, players came away saying it felt like a real place where real people lived. So, the question is that we're going to talk about in our talk is, how did we make the linear feel nonlinear and the unreal feel real through the way that we built the game? One place that we start from is the layout of the overall playable space. I came from a very traditional level design background. I was a level designer on BioShock 2 and the Minerva's Den DLC for that game, and on BioShock Infinite before I went indie and we started the Fullbright Company. And the levels in those games are kind of built all around having a linear progression through a nonlinear space. This is the map screen for the first level of the Minerva's Den DLC, which I was the level designer on. And you can see that it has a very clear hub and spoke structure, which is to say there's this central space that these kind of branches of content extend off of. And so, looking at this from the top down, you can kind of see you enter this central hub, and you might be able to say, am I going to go north or west or east? I'm going to be able to explore this space non-linearly, or at least there's this promise of it's built more like a real place in that it's not built like a hallway. It kind of sprawls out in a radial fashion. And so similarly, in Gone Home, this is the paper map of the first and second floors again, and you enter through the front porch, you get into the grand foyer, and then you kind of have your choice of, am I going to go up the stairs or down the hall, and what part of this house am I going to discover first? And so, when we started from the point of this is the kind of level flow that we're going to rely on, this is the kind of player experience that we need, that defined what kind of fictional space we needed to build. Because this kind of player flow that is evident in this paper map is not really possible in, say, a modern suburban planned community kind of home that might have been built within the last 30 years. Because the layout of a house like that, which we know from reality, from having visited or grown up in these kinds of places, is very different from what was described earlier. Modern homes tend to be very compact and very open plan. You can see that here there is a central room that everything kind of orbits around, and in this blueprint as well. And I mean, these are real blueprints of actual houses that have been built or are being built. But as a level designer, there's no way I can predict what the flow of the player's experience is going to be here. You can kind of enter any space from any other space. You might go in any direction and then subsequently go to any other room following that. And so when you're trying to build a linear progression through a space like this, the ways you would have to do that would be much more evident in that, if you were going to try and build a path through the space, there would be a lot of locked doors, a lot. Similarly, for the practical concerns of level building, this is another open plan blueprint, and an issue is you can see into almost any room from any of the central rooms. You're in the dining room, but you can see into the study, the bedroom, out into the backyard, into the garage, and that's terrible for view occlusion, performance, but also for someone who wants to present a progression of content that tells a story. If you can kind of just look across the room and see something before the designer is hoping to introduce it to you, it just causes additional problems. So if we're starting from a point where we say, we want this hub and spoke structure to how the player experiences the space of the game, and we want to build a linear progression out of it through gating by saying, in this case, the only branch that's open at the beginning is A, and you explore A to get the key to B, and B to get the key to C, and then you can exit the level. What kind of house could be that? And that's what led to one of our very first creative decisions on Gone Home, which was that the family would live in a big, sprawling Victorian manor that had been built in the countryside at the end of the 19th century. So not a house like a sort of standard open-plan suburban house, but a house more like one of these, which has a very different feel, and aesthetically and architecturally it's very different, but more importantly, as far as why this decision was made, its layout is very different. This may look familiar from some of the stuff we were looking at earlier. These Victorian houses, were often built to kind of match the surrounding landscape, and so they tended to spread out and sprawl and be less compact. And B, they were often constructed around these long central corridors that had smaller rooms branching off of them that were isolated and that you kind of had to step into to see fully. They just generally have more interesting and kind of abstract and surprising layouts as well. A compact modern plan house is kind of a box, whereas, you look at this and it's like, this is kind of a fascinating place to find yourself in at a high level. But it supports that hub and spoke exploration where there's this central foyer or a staircase, and then you go down these central halls that spread off into these branches, and you can explore the subspaces that are attached to them, which is exactly what we were trying to do with BioShock levels. And so in this case, we started from what is the gameplay we want? What is the player experience we want? What is the flow that the place that we're going to build going to have to support? And therefore, what is our real-world analog for that? And that was one of the first ways that the gameplay and the layout of the architecture really started talking to each other.
That's me. Hi. So, like I mentioned before, I was the environment modeler. And when I came onto the team, the house was already actually kind of built, at least in a certain respect. I came on a few months into the project, and the game was being created from start to finish, story to ending. So Steve had laid out the first part of the house, which was the upstairs, and then the west wing of the house. And my very first job was to kind of start making this gray block space actually feel like a house. And so obviously, the most obvious thing to do is to put furniture in it. So we kind of had to cultivate this lived-in feeling with actual items populating the house. And it needs, like a house needs, furniture and textiles and, tchotchkes and things like this. And they need to represent the taste and the financial situation of the actual owners living there. And they have to represent the owners from when the house was built in the 1890s all the way up to modern day. And modern day, in our case, was 1995, I think. So we have everything from the Edwardian period and Victorian period to like 70s wall paneling and like mid-century record cabinets and everything in between. And here's some textures, some tiling and unique stuff that I did for the game. This is actually my first game that I ever worked on that had normal maps, and also that had textures that were larger than about 256. So, yeah, so it was a bit of a step up. And actually you could see that in the game, like my first textures were a little bit kind of clunky, a little bit Frankenstein, and at the end it got a little bit better. So this is Sam's room at the beginning of the production. And besides the furniture and the positive space that I was building, the actual negative space of this gray block house needed to feel more like a house. I mean, the rooms in the house actually started quite big, and my first critique when I would start working with a room was often just we need to pull it in. It feels kind of like a bat cave. So sometimes we had to pull it in quite dramatically. Large spaces like this tend to sort of lack intimacy, and when you're trying to make a house, and a house that hopefully you care about the people inside of it, you kind of want to cultivate that feeling of intimacy a little bit better with, unique personal assets and things like that. And then when you're an environment modeler, the idea of filling a space like that with unique personal objects is a little overwhelming. So how you can do that is you don't. You just kind of make the room smaller. So this is Sam's room at launch, and it has a smaller footprint. It's still a pretty big bedroom in the grand scheme of things, but it feels a little bit more welcoming, and it places importance on fewer assets, and I liked that. The bedrooms also, they were just an especially important place for me and, anyone who was kind of, I'm sure for Steve too, but because unlike the common areas, which are used by absolutely everyone in the family and sort of feel that way, the bedrooms are sort of a character distilled, and everything in that space will define them, and what they care about and their relationships to other characters in the house. So this is the two side by side, and the layouts and central elements kind of stayed basically the same, but the furniture to proportion is much more pulled in.
Yeah, I think that, can I get my mic on over here? I can just shout. Okay. I think that Nels and Jake were talking about this in their Firewatch talk. I think it's really easy to start really big, and part of that is me coming from a shooter background where it's like you need a bunch of floor space to navigate and be an FPS player, but the other side of it is if you start with just the space and don't start with like props to give yourself a sense of proportion, you'll think things that are way too big look like they're the right size. So even if you can just get really basic props off of the asset store or super basic gray box props earlier that are the right size, it'll really help you be able to make things a little bit better proportions from the start instead of having to go through like 3 rounds of making the room smaller and smaller like we did.
Smaller. No, Steve, smaller. So while we're talking about architecture, we built a game that takes predominantly, not even predominantly, entirely inside a house. And you don't go outside. So the style of architecture that we chose, the Victorian architecture, kind of plays a huge role. And whatever style you're choosing for your game, it'll, you know, it'll have elements that sort of complement or can kind of hinder, depending on what you're going for. So I found this still of this screenshot of Heavy Rain, and if you played it, you're familiar with this scene, but I think it's a really example of complementary architecture because it's got this boxy modern aesthetic for this character named Ethan, and Ethan is a architect. And so it serves double duty working with a narrative, you know, an architect, it's very visible in his house, but it's also a low poly space. I mean, if you look at it, it's mostly just rectangles and cubes and things, so environment modelers also like it. And, you know, it serves another purpose is kind of being almost a foil for later on when the game starts getting darker and more closed in. It's kind of this direct opposition to this bright, happy time in his life with this, you know, different, more successful time in his life, I guess. But in particular, I kind of wanted to narrow it down to the Victorian architecture, and I know this is really specific, but I'm thinking that, you know, there's probably some takeaways in here. So with a Victorian architecture, Steve was speaking earlier about a Victorian house and why we chose it and how they really help flow. But also things like large foyers kind of allow for breathing room and a chance to sort of orient yourself if you're a player. It's sort of, the moment you step in, it acts as like an establishing shot and acts as like the space that you can refer back to. It's almost a neutral space in some regards. High ceilings with visually interesting details. So this one I like because in Victorian houses you can make things like coffered ceilings and stencil work and tin. If I could just make like tiling tin textures for the rest of my career, that would probably be okay. So pocket doors. Pocket doors are obviously, if you're familiar with Victorian architecture, they're doors which just sort of slide into the adjacent walls. And, you know, I don't really mind doors too much because for me, they're just a rectangle. But when you talk about doors around level designers, they kind of like get this look in their eyes. And when we figured out that we didn't have to use doors with hinges on them, and you didn't then have to worry about players getting caught behind the door, or you didn't have to worry about you know, which way do I make this door swing? The doors in Gone Home actually swing both ways, which is weird. But later on in the East Wing, the later, newer half of the house, we moved to a lot of pocket doors, and it solved a lot of the issues, and just works in the story too. And symbolism and allegory for ambient storytelling. So I'm going to touch upon this a little bit later, but Victorian aesthetics, they're sort of, they give you plenty of opportunity to add more decorative elements, and these decorative elements you can sort of infuse them with meaning that just goes beyond the surface level. So, actually Steve mentioned this before, but when you have closed concept rooms and rooms that all are sort of promote exploration, you're kind of confronted with a series of closed doors. You know, you might get curious. So nooks and crannies and things like that promote this feeling of discovery. So that's great, but there are also less than complementary elements of working with something like a Victorian architecture. Yeah, it's time-consuming to create all that stuff, all those decorative elements, and everything is a decorative element in a Victorian house. Doorknobs and hinges and heating vents and light switches, and so you sort of have to pick your battles when it comes to that stuff. And we had, you know, you have these wonderful main front foyer/foyers. And they're quite wide and like dramatic, but then service passageways would often be like very claustrophobic. So we ended up having to push like the basement and secret passageway tunnels to more modern proportions. And I messed up that slide. There we go. And when you're working with something that is like, when I'm working, I don't live in a Victorian manor house. I lived in a walk-up in Vancouver from the 50s. So visual reference wasn't really readily available. So when you're working with something that's not familiar with you, you have to kind of go out of your way to do more research than you normally would. What would a rural Victorian heating system look like? Or, is this the period when gas lights were working, or electric lights, or some hybrid? So you kind of have to go in deep. And I'm going to talk for a bit about research, because it was so important in the game. Image searching online seems like the default place to start, and it is a very good place to start. But it casts a really wide net, and we're creating a Victorian house in the Pacific Northwest, which is going to use different, materials and things like that. Then here I'm searching for Victorian architecture. It's a party over there, they do love it. But I'm getting pictures of the Painted Ladies here in San Francisco, or I'm getting like museums, or St. Pancras Hotel in, London, and it's not particularly relevant. So you sort of have to laser focus your search. And in this case, it helps to know architectural terms, for one, especially ones that apply directly to your specific style of architecture. For example, octopus furnaces are, Steve's art direction was, give me a furnace that looks like the Home Alone furnace. And an octopus furnace is this big, huge thing with like a grill in front, and it's absolutely that. Or hematite is a very cheap Victorian building material for drawer pulls and for doorknobs that's actually made out of livestock blood. So going even more focused, I found a book. This book is like the answer to all my prayers at the time. What it was is just a book of black and white, like a black and white folio book full of 2 Pacific Northwest manor houses from the 1890s. So exactly what I needed. So we can see that there's house deal. This is actually where we got the idea to start using pocket doors, and some of these, like that knoll post, is pretty close to what we ended up using, et cetera, et cetera. So I really took a lot from the older aspects for making the house. But we also took a trip. We took a road trip. I highly suggest doing it. And we all visited the Pittock Mansion, which is outside of Portland, Oregon. And as a team, we went to go do some region and era appropriate research into how they were built and how they functioned. And this is what it looks like. I know it's not always possible to visit the subject of your game, but if there is a local parallel, it may provide you with ideas that you haven't yet, thought of. Like, we're doing a space game, and we're not going to be able to visit space, but maybe there's something terrestrial that we can look at that we wouldn't have otherwise thought of.
We went and visited a submarine. Took a tour of a submarine.
Yeah, for enclosed.
That's kind of the closest thing to like a space station that we have on Earth, I feel like.
Yeah.
So, but it's always useful just to get into the environment that's the closest analog you can to what you're building.
Sure, Steve. So we took a lot of reference photos for materials and scale and things that we wouldn't have otherwise thought of, anything of special interest. Let's see, some of those materials, marble and things. I think I used those elements of that fireplace almost exactly. That's a shower. I wouldn't have gone there immediately if someone asked me to build a Victorian shower, but obviously it exists and is accurate to the time and place. And so I really like libraries, and this is a library in downtown Portland, Oregon, and it's a really good place to start for reference. I feel like in games creation, it relies so heavily on the digital, and I've often felt like libraries as resources are sort of overlooked. They're not really that immediate. They're sort of out of the way. You kind of have to carry all these books back, I know, but analog sources are often these primary sources and have this added benefit that if you they're not really that easily searchable. I mean, if you're looking for a tiger in your game, just type tiger. You and everyone else who's looking for tiger is going to get that exact same reference. But if you're going to the library, maybe your local library has a bunch of different books or different elements or different sort of, things you can pull from that. So it's something that might not even be available to other concept artists. Practical uses, I guess you just put it in your game. Bye. So this is the west wing of the Greenbrier house, and it has two equally long hallways that go at 90 degrees to one another, and there's very few landmarks to differentiate the two spaces. I don't really like this space too much.
I think it's fair to point out that those are screenshots of two different parts of the house, not the same hallway.
It serves its purpose. You could get from one place to another, but it's very similar. Even the rugs are the same. It's sort of
and to clarify, this one is like the house is built in order, and this part was my fault. Where I'm the level designer, I'm like, a hallway and then another hallway, great, and I put some rugs in and stuff. But it kind of gave us problems to solve as we went forward.
But that Pittock mansion that I mentioned before, so this is the floor print, the blueprint of it. And as you can see, there's circular rooms and there's angled rooms and there's curved halls and all sorts of things that, again, I wouldn't immediately have gone to. So when we start putting that stuff into some quick sketches and quick concept art, immediately the space became more economical and it became more interesting. There's actually angled walls in the west wing where there weren't in the east wing, things like that. I mean, it's just a few layers of interest. So the west or east hall, there it goes. It looks like this, and it's a little bit more interesting. I like it, but it's also not that different from the west wing because from the east wing, west wing, because you can't you can't make one hallway completely different than the other. It still has to feel like the same sort of house. So sometimes, truth is stranger than fiction, and if you think you've done enough research, it really doesn't hurt to do just a smidge more. Steve.
So I think a lot of what Kate was talking about was lending a feeling of authenticity to the house. It started out just as a level designer gray block, and I didn't really do any of that great research stuff that she was talking about. But then when she came in and started collaborating on the layout of the space, it was all about the authenticity of making it feel like this Victorian home. And authenticity was one of the high-level goals of the entire experience, like from the story down to the environments. And as noted, when you kind of are in a single space, when you're in a room, we can dress it up and make that room feel kind of authentic in a tangible way. But we were talking about zooming out from that kind of micro level authenticity to the macro, and how at this point it's no longer functionally authentic to the kind of space that we were building, but that people still kind of scanned it as feeling believable. And so I think it's a really interesting conflict, is how players perceive the spaces that they're experiencing and kind of what you can get away with as a game developer. And I think it comes down to the idea of kind of how much of the game the player can keep in their mind at any time. You as the player, you are seeing one image on your screen at any given moment, and it's your brain's job to retain a snapshot of everything that surrounds it, and brains are actually not good at that. There's this concept that I think I first heard about at Irrational or 2K Marin of player RAM. We know how RAM works in computers. It's kind of what is currently stored in active temporary memory. And as you're playing a game, you're seeing what's on screen, you're reacting to what you're seeing right now, and what has come before and what you are predicting will come next is kind of passing through your head. But you only have a certain amount of capacity to really have a high fidelity image of what kind of higher level structures that's describing. And so I think that players are basically, when they're passing through a three-dimensional kind of like playable space, have the ability to retain the space they're currently in, and the space that is before the space they're currently in, and kind of the space that's before the space that they're currently in, but past that point it gets real fuzzy. And so this is why there was a concept that my former boss at Irrational Games, Ken Levine, looking good, 1999, always emphasized, which was this idea of the arrangement of spaces in a rational order as you experience them. Because, the games that Irrational is best known for creating take place in very strange, non-real places like Rapture and Columbia. But even when you're in a objectivist steampunk underwater city in 1960, you recognize that you're coming into the medical pavilion and you enter the reception area, which then leads to a back hallway, which then leads to an operating theater. And you say, okay, that's how a doctor's office works. This is a real version of one of those kinds of places that I can recognize from my own life. And so in Gone Home, it's important that the porch leads to the foyer, leads to a coat closet. Because as you're passing through the spaces, as they're entering and then passing out of your player RAM, you're saying, okay, well, last place I was in was the entry hall, and I went up the stairs, and I'm in an upstairs hall, and now I'm in the bedroom. That all makes sense. That's how a house works, right? You are creating a mental model of the functionality of this space, and your brain says, that checks out, and it doesn't make you think about how, wait, maybe this isn't really actually a real house, because it scans on the surface, and you fill in the gaps. When you, as a designer, break that chain, and you go from the foyer up the stairs into the kitchen, and you have to pass through it to get to the bedroom, that's not how a house works, and now you're not just thinking about how this game is weird that I'm playing right now, but you're thinking of like, wait, if the kitchen's here, then where is the bedroom and how is this all arranged? And now you're thinking about that big non-possible layout from the beginning. And kind of your goal, I think, as the designer of a place like this is to keep that high level kind of like global sketch of the space out of the player's head and let them remain immersed in the spaces as they're experiencing them. So similarly, going from the layout and the flow of the space to a single room, like Sam's bedroom here, it is also, our job to make you feel as if you are in the space that this place is describing. The construction and arrangement of this room tells you she's a teenage girl growing up in the mid-90s. But this is what a teenage girl's room looks like in Gone Home. This is what a teenage girl's room looks like in real life. These are from teenagebedroom.tumblr.com. And people can just submit photos of their bedroom when they were a teenager. And you can see that the density of decoration and clutter in these rooms is just magnitudes beyond anything that we could build or render, even if we wanted to, in a game like Gone Home. Compared to reality by any concrete metric, Sam's room and all of the other inhabited rooms of the house are really bare and understuffed. But people looked at these spaces and they called them out as lived in and believable and real. IGN said the bedroom of an angsty teenager feels like the bedroom of an angsty teenager. Gone Home's world just feels straight up real. And so I think what's important here is that the reviewer says that the room feels real and that the game world feels real. And I think that kind of comes back to this concept from a really important book to read if you're thinking about player psychology and how to communicate with an audience visually, is Understanding Comics by Scott Mccloud. And in this book he's talking about comic books and illustration and how they work, but there are a number of concepts in here that kind of transmit out to the kind of work that we do. One of the most important ones, in my opinion, being this idea that he has of abstraction or amplification through simplification, which is to say there's this continuum of truly photorealistic imagery to almost entirely symbolic imagery. And the idea here is that he posits the more simplified an image is, the more able the audience is to project their own vision of what it's supposed to look like onto it. And the more specific and realistic the image is, the less that they can kind of put themselves in the understanding of what it's supposed to represent. So, just as 2 dots plus a line in a circle equals a face to us, You see a messy bed and posters and homework and celebrity photos and stuffed animals, and it says to me, those are the signifiers of a teen girls' room, and that's where I am right now. And my brain can fill in all of that missing clutter and detail much better than we as game developers could, even if we had the resources to build all that junk. You know, the lack of literal detail and the focus on just the important signifiers, it allows the player to be more involved in the construction of the space as they experience it. You know, but beyond that, just beyond the visual and the kind of the experiential aesthetic side of it, there's also the interactive side, which is to say, you know, everybody's games are beholden to whatever their core game mechanics are. And in Gone Home, our core game mechanics, our interactive promise was you can examine everything, you can pick up everything, you can look at everything. And so if we wanted to make a very literal teen girls' room, we would have to let you pick up all these Hello Kitties and all these things, and we would have to make texture maps and models for all this stuff, and I don't even know what those are, and we would just never get done, right? So being able to focus down and say, what are the subset of the most important images that represent the idea we want to get across, and allowing the player to only encounter those and then kind of inhabit the negative space between them is the route we went, and I think the most effective way to let the player kind of be involved in that process.
Hi, again.
Okay.
Hi. So Steve was talking about placing greater importance on fewer assets. And one of those ideas is if you were to walk around the house and Gone Home with no text or audio diaries and what you could tell just from those fewer assets. So, I mean, obviously you could tell that the house is maybe about 100 years old or so. You know, maybe that there's elements of modernity, and if you're familiar with the 90s, if you're familiar with things like electric typewriters or wood paneling, you could tell, you know, approximately when things are going on, because sets are sort of a dead giveaway. And you can probably tell that it's a family that lives here, or a middle-class urban family, probably American, possibly Canadian. So it tells a story that the house is old and retains some of its original furniture, but you know, here we are. Oh, this is my favorite thing. I wanted to show you. So our main source of reference for the bones of the house was Heritage Lost, the book I mentioned before. But the main reference point for the 90s elements and all the pieces of furniture that we needed to build was the Sears catalog that Carla had bought off eBay. And eBay is a good resource for finding, again, primary sources of reference. Here it is. It looks like garbage because I've literally taken this all around the world with me at this point. I've taken it to England and Norway, and I moved from Vancouver with it, and so it's about to fall apart. But there is a page about the Sega Genesis that's really fun. So there we go. Early on, the pieces that I was building that felt like they might suit the personality of the family itself. The Greenbriers were flagged for early reference. That's what all those green tags are in there. And they often went through this filter among the team of, do I remember seeing something like that growing up? Does it kind of hit those same nostalgia pings that it should? And generally, they were practical objects with a sort of subtle 90s aesthetic to them. Because if you start pushing too 90s in aesthetic, it can seem like parody. That's a carpeted bathroom. There's carpet on the tank, too. Some of the reference in this book, despite it being like of the period and readily available, was just entirely too much. So we did reproduce some items almost exactly. This Pompeii peach lamp is in the game. And it's pretty much dead on. But some objects were just sort of subtly tweaked. That table went through a different coat of varnish. The proportions of that couch are a little different. The silhouette and design of the wicker furniture. We sort of, because we were such a small team, there wasn't really an art director, but there was Steve. And every time I had like a question or concern, I would go to him and pitch him something, and he would be like, uglier. I need you to make this uglier.
we knew we wanted the white wicker, but the white wicker in the catalog was not quite ugly enough.
Yeah.
And Kate made it hideous,
Yeah.
which I will appreciate forever.
This is garbage, I love it. And then changing tactics a little bit more, I wanted to talk about subtlety. I guess the two things are related. Sometimes we weren't really successful with our attempts at reinforcing the story through the environment or through the assets that we were creating, even when text was involved. And sometimes you can put a lot of effort into something that's too subtle for the player to pick up on. I know environment modelers often, rightfully so, get dinged for things like expository graffiti, but you can also completely swing the other direction, which is what we did a couple of times. So there's this piece of evidence pointing very obliquely at a piece of the family's backstory. And if you didn't find it, neither did I. It's in this room. I actually didn't know it was there until the game shipped. So the deepest backstory is that the oldest generation of the family, so Uncle Oscar's parents and the original creators of the house, made their fortune distilling and selling liquor in Oregon. And that's where the money to build this house came from. But the only evidence for that is that single note hidden here in the dark in the corner of this pitch black room of the basement. And it alludes sort of vaguely to the idea that during Prohibition, the sheriff was buying bootleg liquor from the family in exchange for looking the other way. But we did put some effort into reinforcing that story a little bit. I really wanted to use that sort of ambient Victorian motifs and allegory that I was talking about before. And we didn't know what people would and wouldn't get, so it's sort of a crapshoot. But I included these grain motifs into the house itself, in the frieze and in the cornices of the central staircase, so, quite prominently placed. And also in the original dining room furniture. I don't think it was mentioned in any of the reviews. I don't think many people picked up on it, it's fine. It's super subtle. And I mentioned this on the blog, but on the Fullbright Company blog, but I really like it, so I want to talk about it again. I was talking about Victorian symbolism, and with Victorians, they had this language of flowers, this idea that a different flower will evoke a different meaning. So roses are obviously romantic love, and daisies are representative of innocence. And at the time, this would have been understood, but the rue motif, and actually in Victorian symbolism, is the symbolic flower of regret, which is kind of a common theme throughout the game. It's also actually in Ophelia's bouquet in Hamlet, if you're familiar with the play. And also, depending on the source that you're looking at, it's also representative of infidelity, which is another theme in the game. So it shows up in the central doors, and it shows up in the leaded glass, and in the closets, and in the ends of the knoll post. But the Venn diagram of people that are familiar with old-timey Victorian flower language, and then independent game players are not the average. Doesn't really work. So that symbolic stuff that we were working with, the bootlegging motifs and the floral stuff, was really fun to work on. It's kind of really what I'm into. And we hoped it would add to, some players' experiences of it, but the lesson is that you can go really over the top with overly literal graffiti, or you can swing the other way and put a lot of effort into environmental storytelling and symbolism that the player is probably not going to get much out of.
There were ups and downs. There were successes and failures in the stuff that we tried to do in the game, kind of, in all aspects. But all throughout, what we were trying to do was ensure that the spaces always supported the gameplay, the core player experience of discovering the story, and that the gameplay and that story that you were discovering always supported the space and the fiction of the architecture of when it was built and what this place was supposed to be. And we pursued that using a few core tenets, which were that the form of the fiction and the setting must serve the gameplay's requirements, which is what brought us to a Victorian house in the first place. That we always attempted to reinforce the setting and the story with level layout and environment art, and vice versa. That we would always go to original sources for environment art research, and I mean, it's a totally different talk, but for story research as well, to get past your kind of like most easily accessible online sources and try to find as many primary sources of research as you can. And then to arrange spaces to read as rational and believable at arm's length, and tune the density of environment decoration to read as authentic without overloading the scene with a realistic amount of visual noise. You know, to these ends, we intended always for the environment to be in dialogue with the story, to be in dialogue with the player, and for all these elements to be in harmony and to make each other stronger. And if you try to kind of think of each of those elements of your game in terms of all the others that they're talking to, hopefully the player gets something valuable out of being a part of that dialogue in the end. I'm Steve.
Okay.
You can email us. Thank you. We can take probably like, I don't know, 4 or 5 questions, and then there's going to be a coffee break after this, and then back for the next talk at 4:30, Liz England. So if anybody has a question, please feel free to come up to one of the 3 mics that are in the middle of the room. Hi.
Hey, so you talked a little bit about your goal being feeling nonlinear. When did you decide not to actually make it nonlinear? Or why? Or did you even?
It was always going to be linear within a space that was constructed as nonlinear. And I think that that's true of a lot of game levels, which is to say you might play a game that takes place, let's see, like a level like the apartment building in Max Payne 2, which at the end of the day, like they built an apartment building that was built in like a nonlinear architectural fashion like an apartment building might be, but then they also made it under siege by gangsters and there was a bunch of destruction, so you had to like not go down this hallway because there's a fire there, and you had to go through this apartment and out onto the balcony and then back into the hallway and stuff. And so that and so many other games are about creating a linear, predictable player path through something that's not just built as a hallway. And that was our goal all along, and it's just a question of like what version of that you do. In our case, that was at the beginning, certain parts of the house are locked off, and by exploring it, you actually, at the end of the game, have access to the full non-linearity of the place. But the challenge was to do that without the player really just constantly thinking about, wow, another key for another locked door, and just trying to balance that.
Thanks.
Yeah. Mario?
Hey, Steve.
How's it going?
Good,
we
how are
worked
you?
on Minerva's Den together. He was one of the other level designers on it. How's it going, man?
I'm pretty good. One thing I'm curious about, this is kind of a chicken or the egg question. In a game like this, which comes first? Is it, does the layout of the house influence the rhythm at which you deliver the story beats? Or is it the other way around? Is the way you want to deliver the story influence the way you lay out the house, or is it a little bit of both?
I mean, something that's nice about building something like a house that a family lives in is that there's a bunch of constraints that are put on you by the expectations that the player has, where it's like there has to be a kitchen, there has to be a bedroom, there has to be bathrooms, you know, where do they watch TV, the basement has to be underneath the rest of the house. You know, there are all these kind of things that kind of tell you, okay, we have to put these places in. And so in our case, it was generally saying, once we know what the, you know, if we're making the East Wing, it has to have the dining room and the kitchen and the, you know, garage and the laundry room and stuff. And so how are we going to arrange those in a way that it makes sense to have XYZ plot point that we need to have in the space you're going to have to be in when that happens? And, you know, you can push those things around, but at least it isn't just a wide open, you know, totally blank slate. It kind of gives you something to work towards. So I guess they develop alongside one another, generally. Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hi, Steve. Hi, Kate. Thank you very much first. That was really good.
Thanks.
Now, I have just a quick question. Was there at any point, like either of you guys had an idea, like you thought this was super cool, and then from the level design was not viable, or from the environment not viable? And how did you deal with that discussion between the two of you?
Actually, never
Well, I mean, something that jumps to mind for me is early on, one of the spaces in the house was like a small guest house, and you were going to walk through the backyard to get to it. And at some point we were like, we're not letting the player go outside. No, like we have to look at particle effects. It's going to rain on you? No. Now you're all wet. That's not going to happen in the game. And so the discussion then became, how can we have kind of the feel that we're looking for without letting the player actually out into the yard? And that's why the back porch of the house turned into a greenhouse. So you have this feeling of kind of being surrounded by the outdoors and being surrounded by plants, but you still stay inside the house the entire time. So yeah, saying like, here's our blue sky idea. What's the thing that can, again, kind of get you that feeling without having to like do a bunch of unique stuff that's not going to appear anywhere else and causes a bunch of hard problems for us, is where that discussion leads to.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay. Hi.
So I had a question about immersion in general. I know that immersion is sort of like a very broad idea, making the player feel like they really live in your world, which you did fantastically with the clutter of the house and making it feel lived in. And there's a lot of discussions about, tying that into the world and the mechanics and using that to fuel the story. Where do you see techniques for immersion going in the future? I know you guys are working on something new, which I'm sure a lot of people are very excited for. But sure. I know that like Oculus and VR is sort of like what a lot of people view as the next step of the player being in depth, which I actually disagree. Yeah. I think that you can do really, really cool stuff without that. So where do you see non-virtual reality things going to increase player immersion? Yeah.
I'm on the same page as you. I mean, whatever. I'm not interested in VR. I don't know. I don't want to put some shit on my face. I don't know. Like, it's speaking of literalism, it's a very literal interpretation of, well, if you want to be immersed in a space, put the screen right here. It's like, I don't think that's what makes you feel like you're really there, right? Like, I think it is much more of a question of being able to project yourself into the space that the character is occupying, and that can happen here, or it can happen here, or it can happen when you're sitting on your couch, right? It's like, it's about putting the player in the shoes of the person who's having the experience that's on screen. And I think that, AV is part of that, like good sound design of feeling like, oh, I'm surrounded by this rainstorm that's outside of the house, or the light and shadow is really convincing or whatever. But, more important than that, I think, is the immersion of interactivity, which is to say you give the player a role and you give them the tools to occupy that role and play out that role, and you don't put anything into the game that is going to break their expectations of being able to do what that person would be doing in that situation. So, in Gone Home, it's like, we made you a member of the family who's returned home from after a long time away, and your family has moved into this house while you were gone. So you've never been here, the character's never been here, something weird has happened here, you want to find out what happened. We have to let you open all the drawers and all the cabinets and examine all the things to figure out what you're trying to figure out. And there were points where we had to make serious decisions based on the fact that if we made certain level design or art decisions, it would break that paradigm for the player. Like at one point, okay, so you might have seen, you might remember that the kitchen is kind of being renovated when you come into the house. At one point, that renovation was blocking off the pantry, so you couldn't go into the pantry. And I put the things there, and I went in to play test it, and I hit my shins on this thing, and I could see a space that I couldn't go into, and it was like, we can't do that, right? Because now the player is thinking, I can't fulfill my role that you've signed me up for. And I think being able to maintain that headspace is what really keeps you immersed in something above and beyond how it's presented visually, auditorially, etc.
So do you plan on tying that more into more gameplay mechanics in the future, or are you going to try and keep things more simple?
I don't know.
Fair enough.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi. So since so much of the enjoyment of Gone Home comes from that sense of authenticity, how do you play test to make sure that you're on the right track when it feels like you need everything to be in place to get that mood?
I mean, we did a lot of play testing. I think that's one part of it is get people to look at your stuff as often as you can, as often as it's feasible for your process. But I think it's really dangerous to kind of be heads down and just work on your stuff for so long that by the time you show it to people, you can't change it. What?
And get people to play a game that don't normally play games, because there's this really incestuous thing with games where you have this language, this knowledge, this deep breadth of it. And if you're creating a game about authenticity, and then you're just, doing the same old things. If I invite my sister who doesn't play games, to take a look at it, she's going to be able to tell me immediately what's weird in an uncanny valley and doesn't quite feel right.
So if you had like the gray box levels, was that enough to get people invested in the game and the story?
Well, that's I think that's the question of who you get to playtest at what point. Because we did a bunch of rounds of playtesting, and the first time that we sent out playtests, it was super gray box. It was like just a little bit past those gray box rooms that Kate was showing. And we sent it to like maybe 20 fellow game developers who had shipped titles and knew what an alpha game looked like. It could kind of like project forward to what we were going for. And each time we did another playtest, we sent it wider because, by the point that you get to something where most of the end user player experience is there, you can get totally naive players that like hardly ever play video games. And if they don't get it at that point, then you have a problem, But it's tuning your playtest audience to each stage of production, I think.
Thanks.
Yeah. I guess, one more? Is that enough? Too much?
You can continue the Q&A, but the coffee break begins now. So.
Oh, okay. Coffee break is starting now. I guess just to keep it clean, so there's a clean break. Coffee break, back at 4:30. We'll go down here, and anybody else that wants to ask a question, we can do it kind of one-on-one. Thank you again for having us, everybody.